Hello, my name is Hitendra Patel. I'm the Managing Director of the Global Innovation Management Institute. I'd like to welcome you and join our vision and our mission of the Institute. Our vision is to democratize innovation everywhere. In organizations like universities or corporations, in high schools, in governments. And the idea is to unleash that creativity across the globe. Our mission is much more simpler: to train 1 million people worldwide, certify them, and unleash their creativity and their problem-solving skills to target any problem on this planet. The Global Innovation Management Institute has got certifications for individuals, for corporations, as well as for the government. And the whole idea over here is through certifications, people have the right to practice innovation. Through certifications, we create a roadmap for how to get better and improve as we get level 1 certificate to level 2 to level 3. We are today working with the Dubai government, the Qatar government, across Colombia, in Brazil, in the United States, helping these institutes and these countries become better in terms of their innovation journeys. We're working with corporations, giving them roadmaps, how they can go from level 1 to level 2. And we're giving certificates to individuals as they go from level 1, 2, 3, and 4 in terms of how they can actually innovate themselves, how they can innovate in teams, and how they can innovate in a company.
We've worked with several innovation consultancies, and we found the Gimi methodology to be able to help us democratize innovation very quickly across large groups of people.
Curriculum isn't enough anymore. We need to really be finding ways to expand the school into the community and bring the communities into the school. And design thinking and the Gimi impact model is what's going to help do that. I think that we really need to start looking for authentic, experiential learning opportunities for our students. And this is a really great framework that teachers can use that makes it easy to do.
The value that we see being part of the Gimi program is that we can offer capability building for students, for professionals, for corporations. And that's really exciting to be able to create a language that can help everybody connect with what strategic innovation is.
Today, we've got 25 countries who are partners of the Global Innovation Management Institute. We'd like to see all 195 plus countries becoming part of this institute. So we are looking for training partners across the globe. We're looking for university partners in every one of those countries so they can be part of our network. And we would like to see companies and corporations around the world all embracing the certification programs of Gimi. And as a result, we can target any problem and we can solve any problem. Join us on our mission through certificates to give people the right to practice and a roadmap of how to improve.
Okay, thank you very much. So today, as you know, there is Gimi Think Tank. Gimi Think Tank is a weekly platform that we run since 2020. We do this consistently every week, every Wednesday at 9 a.m. The aim of this community is basically to create awareness around innovation and Gimi framework, as well share valuable and cutting-edge knowledge from distinguished speakers around the world. We talk about different trends, we talk about innovative solutions, and we talk about as well some of the main futuristic centers that Gimi has created. Gimi has created 3 futuristic centers on the future of banking, basically. We have created the Gen AI and as well future of green hydrogen and green energy. Today, every last week of the month, we focus this on the green hydrogen and basically green energy, and we invite speakers around that topic. Today, we'll have basically a topic which is about hydrogen electrolysis and direct air capture, scaling up capacity and bringing down cost. And this is very interesting. We have 2 speakers actually today. So if you help me spotlight Jacques and Peter. So both, let's say Peter and Jacques are basically affiliated with Guidehouse Insights. Peter is the associate director and Jacques is the senior research analyst. Basically, for Peter, his work has been focused on basically chemical feedstock, transportation, power sectors. He has been focused in different aspects of hydrogen value chain, basically alternative fuels and decarbonization technologies. He has worked as senior editor and Standard & Poor Global, leading the all news desk for the market intelligence division. And basically, he has 20 years of extensive experience working in the energy field as an editor, reporter, analyst. And on the other side, Jacques as well, as we mentioned, is a senior research analyst at the same company, and he has been focused on hydrogen production technologies, fuel cell technologies, industrial hydrogen demand. He's the lead author of Guidehouse Insight Electrolyzer Supply and Demand Outlook. He contributes to the company, basically hydrogen electrolyzer tracker. And on the other side, he has a Master of Science in Energy Policy from the University of Sussex and Bachelor in English Studies. So thank you very much, Peter and Jacques, for accepting our invitation for today. We would like to hear more about this topic. We will have like around 30 minutes to talk, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So for everybody, please use your chat to share any questions or comments that you might have for both speakers. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Should we bring up some slides, Peter? Yep. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. I think we can skip forward to the introduction slide. I'll skip introducing ourselves again. But essentially, what we'll be doing with this presentation is we'll follow a pretty similar structure for both halves of the presentation. So one on electrolyzers and one on DAC. And really our aim is that by the time we've finished, you should have a pretty good idea of where the electrolyzer and direct air capture industries are at in terms of current and projected capacity, how quickly the cost of the technology can be reduced, and which factors will determine what types of players in both of those sectors can be successful. Let's move on to the next slide. But before we get into that, I just want to give you a quick introduction to Guidehouse Insights in case you're not familiar with us. So Guidehouse is a global consulting and advisory firm with a pretty broad footprint across the hydrogen, CCS, and industrial decarbonization spaces. So stuff we've worked on includes coordinating the European Hydrogen Backbone Initiative, assisting with CCS cluster projects in the UK, and also supporting some of the hydrogen hub proposals in the US. And then Insights itself is the market intelligence arm of Guidehouse. So we produce quarterly reports on hydrogen, CCS, distributed energy resources, EVs, and other clean energy technologies. We also produce a range of trackers and data products, including the electrolyzer and CCS trackers that we'll be referencing in this presentation today. And if anyone wants to find out more about us, feel free to reach out after the webinar concludes. We can skip forward. One more. So for the electrolyzer part of the presentation, which I'll be starting off with, first I'll give you a market overview and status update. Then we'll move on to the core part of the presentation, which looks at the different cost components for green hydrogen production and what those mean for the levelized cost of hydrogen going forward. Then I'll conclude with some of the success factors for industry players and some key takeaways. On back, please. Thank you. So the first question I want to answer is where the green hydrogen industry finds itself today. And personally, I think it's helpful to think about the development of the sector in roughly 4 phases, as you'll see on this slide. So just to give you a kind of background, the basic technology for electrolysis has been around for roughly a century, but really up until quite recently, it's been in a kind of steady state. So just a few companies active, not a lot of installed capacity, some public funding for electrolyzers and fuel cells, but really more focused on the fuel cell side and on R&D. But nothing comparable to the levels that we've seen over the past few years. And also a lot of the companies that were active in the space generated most of their revenues from chlor-alkali projects rather than power to X. Then in 2017, we had the publication of the Basic Hydrogen Strategy in Japan. In 2020, we had the European Hydrogen Strategy in the EU, and you had this sudden uptick in national hydrogen strategies across the world, and also electrolyzer capacity targets both in Europe and beyond. And really that period of growing momentum was reflected in a lot of the long-term scenarios released by the IEA and other research organizations. And then if you move through to the period that we're now in, it's one where we've seen continued growth in this electrolyzer project pipeline, but also significant growth in operational manufacturing capacity and planned manufacturing capacity, and the entry of a raft of new manufacturing players. It's also a period where we've seen a fair amount of movement on the policy front. So you've had the launch of the European Hydrogen Bank, you've had the finalization of emissions accounting criteria, which I'll explain later, in the EU. You've also had the IRA in the US, where there are some notable tax credits for hydrogen. And that's just a few of the examples globally. But just as important as the momentum we're seeing is that it's also been a challenging period with a lot of project timelines for green hydrogen projects pushed back, a lot of debate and uncertainty about the regulations, and also a challenging set of macroeconomic conditions for developing capital-intensive projects, which I'll come to. And because of that, we've seen that there's this disconnect between the pace of investment in the manufacturing side, which has outpaced growth in actual green hydrogen production capacity, which is really around the 1 to 2 gigawatt mark. So the question is, for me, when do we start to see those barriers being resolved and a real capacity ramp up occurring? And analysts have been predicting for some time that that's imminent. I've penciled it in for 25 to 26 here, but I think that that's kind of anyone's guess when that's going to happen. So we can move through. I want to talk a bit more about what the current state of affairs means for manufacturers. So I've included a list of recent headlines here, all from the last several months, to give you some sense of the pressures that they're under. So the situation, it differs from manufacturer to manufacturer. Some have fairly robust order books built up over the last few years that they're focused on delivering. But broadly speaking, the situation is that orders are coming in more slowly than initially hoped for, and costs are also higher than initially planned for. So many manufacturers are having to sell equipment at a loss, both because as a kind of conscious strategy to secure market share, and also due to increases in material and manufacturing costs that they can't pass through to customers due to the nature of their contractual agreements. I don't want to be too negative about it, because on the one hand, it's a difficult operating environment, but also it has prompted a stronger focus on capital discipline and on delivering real world projects in the short term. And when we do start to see that demand pick up, which I think manufacturers are still confident of, the sector will have been stronger for moving through this period. Move to the next slide. So in terms of the outlook for manufacturing capacity, we have 3 graphics here. What you see on the left is current and planned manufacturing capacity, which is based on Insight's electrolyzer tracker. So that pulls together manufacturer announcements globally. And you'll see that we're tracking about 200 gigawatts of manufacturing capacity by 2030. And that excludes some of the less well substantiated announcements from new market entrants. I also caution that those figures probably underestimate the amount of capacity in China, where really the manufacturers are a bit less transparent about their scale-up plans. And then in terms of what those figures translate to for deployed projects, it really depends on what utilization rate you expect these factories to operate at. So if you look at the stated capacity today and the amount of orders that are actually being fulfilled, it suggests an average utilization rate only in the kind of single percentage digit range. And given how many manufacturers have struggled to deliver orders on schedule, that almost certainly means that there's some significant overrepresentation of operational capacity. But if you go with a more optimistic utilization value of 50% during the period from now to 30, so an average utilization over that period, what that gets you to is the deployed hydrogen production capacity of around 160 gigawatts by that year. And that compares to a pipeline of more than 250 gigawatts, so all of the projects that are planned added together. But it's also ahead of our own internal forecasts for capacity deployment, which are closer to 90 gigawatts by that year. And then in terms of the breakdown between technologies, which is what's on the graphic on the far right, you would see deployments dominated by the two most mature technologies, unsurprisingly. So alkaline at 42% of capacity and PEM at 33%. Move on to the next slide. So this is the main part of the presentation, which looks at the different drivers for cost reduction. And the first element I want to touch on there is capital costs. So what we've started to see over the last couple of years is a bit more realism and transparency over total plant costs for hydrogen projects. So what you can see there on the top right is the average stated installed cost of green hydrogen projects from the H2 hubs applications in the US. So that's an instrument where hydrogen project developers could apply for funding from the DOE. And it's split by project size. So for reference, I think about 75% of this capacity was PEM, which tends to be a little bit more expensive from a capital cost perspective than alkaline. But the average cost across all of those applications is $2,100 per kilowatt, and the average project size there is 350 megawatts. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that over the last few years, these average costs have actually increased. So that's due in large part to inflationary pressure, which of course means that you need a higher rate of return for investors. And because of that, we haven't really seen this decline in project costs as learning rates kick in. And I think it's also important to look at what the cost contribution is from different parts of a project, just to see how applicable that type of learning rate thinking you hear about often with clean energy technologies is when we're looking at this specific example of electrolyzers. So you need to think about it in terms of direct costs. So that's the cost of equipment delivery, on-site engineering versus indirect costs. So that's management expenses and contingencies. And I think why there was maybe a little bit of less realism in previous cost estimates is because they've neglected the contribution of indirect costs. And then you need to look at the breakdown in cost between different types of equipment provision. So the stack, which is what it's often focused on, it's the core part of an electrolyzer system where reactions occur. It only contributes between 15 and 40% to the total cost of equipment supply. And the variability you have there is partly to do with the stack technology, but also to do with the system scale. So at larger system scales, you need less balance of plant, which is all the other equipment around the stack, such as power electronics, gas processing. So the cost contribution there from the BOP is lower to the overall cost, which is why you see this trend to system costs coming down for the larger systems in the H2 hubs estimates. And it's also why it's quite important to focus on the stack as a proportion of total project costs, because we expect to see a lot of the learning rate applied to the stack. It's the most novel technology component. It's where manufacturing scale up can really make a difference. Whereas these balance of plant components I've talked about, they're typically more mature technologies. They're already employed for other applications. So there's much more limited cost reduction potential. Move to the next slide. So on this slide, I'm showing you some of the different business models pursued by manufacturers. So you can see dedicated stack suppliers on the left to fully integrated turnkey project providers on the right. And the reason I'm showing this in relation to this question of cost reduction is that part of the way manufacturers and EPCs as well can bring down costs is by optimizing cost and performance at the system level. So as an example, one way you could do that is by delivering projects in repeatable blocks of capacity with identical balance of plant. And that then unlocks efficiencies through larger volume orders on the BOP subsystems. Or another way you could do that would be to optimize your stack technology around the BOP. So you might end up with a higher stack cost, but reduced requirements for more expensive BOP. And I think it's important to add as well that doesn't necessarily mean that manufacturers with a more comprehensive scope of equipment supply have an advantage, because you can have a kind of close collaboration between a stack manufacturer and an EPC, which allows them to provide a kind of similar service offering. Move to the next slide. So we've covered the CapEx. I want to move on to the OpEx. So for pretty much any electrolyzer project with a realistic capacity factor, the electricity costs are going to be the main contributor to your LCOH. And what you see on this slide, it's probably fairly familiar. It's a summary of IRENA's data on the reduction in the cost of electricity supply from renewable resources. And it shows a generally sustained cost decline over that region, over that period. And how much that would still need to decline further is something I'll come back to. Go to the next slide. The other thing to pay attention to from an electricity cost perspective is the efficiency of your electrolyzer. So just how much electricity you need to consume in order to produce each unit of H2. And again, you can think about that at the stack level or the system level. I put a sample of different stack efficiency figures from different manufacturers there on the left. Those are all at beginning of life and relative to the lower heating value. And you can see from that graphic that most manufacturers are in that kind of 67% to 73% bracket. Some higher values for SOEC, which is more efficient because you can use a kind of external heat source to boost your efficiency there. Also important that because it's beginning of life, over the lifetime of the stack, that efficiency declines. You'll typically replace the stack after you have a 10% reduction in efficiency. So over the lifetime of the project, you're looking at a few percentage points lower in terms of overall efficiency. Then with the system, you also have various losses from the BOP, which reduce the total system efficiency. Usually those losses are about 10% of overall power consumption. And you can see that the big difference there between PEM and alkaline is the need for compression for alkaline, which operates at atmospheric pressure. And then there are some kind of more novel technologies down the line. So SOEC, also CFE, ETAC, they promise much higher efficiencies. But if we stick to the kind of 2030 time horizon that we're focused on in this presentation, the vast majority of deployed capacity is going to be PEM and alkaline. And we really only expect to see incremental improvements to electrolyzer efficiencies over that period, which again means limited contributions to cost reduction. Next slide. So if we look at what the cost of green hydrogen production is today, similar to plant costs, we've seen a bit of a shift from kind of over-optimism to a bit more transparency and realism as developers started vying for funding. So what we're showing on this slide is the expected LCOH in bids submitted under the first European Hydrogen Bank auction, where we had the winners announced this month. And you can see that they're pretty strongly correlated with renewable energy costs, which is perhaps not unsurprising. The lowest costs are in the Iberian Peninsula and the Nordic countries. That's also where you had most of the winning bids from. And the average cost across all of the submissions is about €7 for alkaline projects, a little over 10 for PEM, and lower expected costs for projects that combine both technologies. We can move to the next slide. So if we bring everything that I presented together, I've given you a sense of what current plant costs are. I've talked through the average LCOH. So let's look at what would need to happen to make hydrogen cost competitive and to deliver on policy targets. So in the US, there's a DOE target to bring costs down to $1 per kilo by 2030. In the EU, the Commission has talked about getting it below €2 per kilo. Here, let's use that €2 per kilo value, which is also roughly what you would need to make green hydrogen cost competitive with grey hydrogen. So what we're showing is three different scenarios based around a kind of archetypal green hydrogen project using a combination of wind and solar and operating about 2/3 capacity factor. In the first example on the left, you see what happens if we reduce plant capex in increments of 25%, but stick with a static electricity price. So there's no assumption about electricity cost reduction. In the middle, we do the opposite. So we leave capex as it is, but then we reduce the electricity price by 25% increments. And then in the final scenario, you reduce both the capex and the electricity price together, again in increments of 25%. And you can see there that electricity cost is more impactful than reducing plant capex, but really the only scenario in which you actually reach that €2 per kilo target is one where you're reducing both the plant capex and electricity cost in tandem by 75%. And the reason I show you that is just to give you a sense of how difficult it is to reach those goals. So they're achievable over the long term, but really most likely it's not something that we're going to be able to accomplish this decade outside of maybe a few exemplary projects. Next slide, please. So I think we're running a little short of time here, but I'll move through this quickly. So one last thing I want to touch on before we get to the conclusions. The carbon intensity of green hydrogen projects it's something that's very much related to the regulatory barriers that I talked on at the beginning of the presentation. And the uncertainty there has focused on how you ensure that electricity supplies are truly renewable, so don't indirectly contribute to increases in fossil generation. So in the EU, that question has been resolved. There are these 3 pillars that have been adopted. I can talk to that in the Q&A. And in the US, it looks as if they're going to take a similar approach, but there's been a lot of pushback to what they're doing. But there really is an important distinction between the US and the EU, in that in the US, the subsidies that are available, they're essentially unrestricted in terms of the amount of capacity that can be awarded these tax credits. Whereas in the EU, you have all of these much more restricted and competitive national and regional instruments. So there's no guarantee of funding. So the comment I want to make is just that while these rules can be a headache for project developers, it really is important in the US context that the rules are sufficient to prevent emissions increases, or if not, then if there's a leniency period, it needs to be coupled with some kind of cap in the amount of capacity that can secure that leniency. Next slide, please. So what will it take to make the green hydrogen industry successful? We have these 3 categories here. One is the regional and national level, where it's a clearer regulatory environment, sufficient funding, low attractive renewable energy costs, and so forth. Much of the things I've talked about. With manufacturers, there's a few things to consider. So as I mentioned, a turnkey offering or a close EPC partnership that really assists with bringing down system costs. You want sufficient manufacturing capacity to deliver the types of projects that build trust in the market without exposing yourself to too much risk if orders don't come in at the expected pace. You also want a fairly differentiated technology offering. Then with developers, you want a strong understanding of the technologies available and how particular technologies of supplier choices contribute to cost reduction. Also helpful to have a head start in terms of off-taker relationships, and also the correct balance between ambition and realism during the challenging scale-up period. Let's move on to the last slide. So the final messages I want to leave you with are, number one, we've seen slower than expected growth or progress in capacity scale-up and cost reduction. And that really poses a challenge for these 2030 policy targets. But at the same time, those challenges will help to drive innovation in the sector, also capital discipline on the part of the technology players I've talked about. Number 2 is that manufacturers, despite these challenges, are still confident that demand increases are imminent. So it's really just a question of timing. Number 3 is that the need for cost reduction, which I hope I've brought across as important, requires a focus on optimization at the system level. And that's increasingly being reflected in the types of the joint venture agreements and business strategies that manufacturers are pursuing. And then lastly, number 4 is that this question of electricity sourcing, it really is key for developers and for policymakers, since it's what most strongly determines both the cost of production and also the kind of emission saving that you can achieve with green hydrogen compared to other technologies. So with that, I can pass over to Peter.
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Alina. So just to provide a sense of what I intend to cover in this presentation, we'll start with the market overview. What is DAC, direct air capture? Where are we in terms of the industry development, and where are all the current DAC projects located or being developed? Next, we'll take a look at the cadence of the capacity scale up to 2030. We'll take a look at the carbon intensity, and then we'll explore some of the potential barriers to growth. You'll hear me say that DAC projects are expensive to build and operate. So we'll take a look at what needs to be done to bring down costs. One of the key reasons DAC is so expensive to operate is because it's got really high energy requirements. So we'll also take a look at the various power supply options. And then lastly, we'll take a look at how to finance DAC projects and monetize the captured CO2. So what is DAC? Direct air capture is a way of removing CO2 from ambient air, usually through large fans that draw in air and expose it to chemicals that capture the CO2. And then extract or regenerate the CO2 in a controlled process that prevents the CO2 from leaking back into the atmosphere. DAC technology is relatively new and evolving. The two pioneering methods for DAC were liquid DAC and solid DAC. There are some new up and coming technologies such as electrochemical DAC that were introduced just in the past few years. So they're still a way off in terms of commercialization, but I just wanted to focus on the liquid DAC and the solid DAC for now. At the risk of oversimplifying a complex process, you might want to think of LDAC as a sponge and SDAC is more like Velcro. Liquid DAC uses an aqueous basic solution such as potassium hydroxide to capture the CO2 and then regenerates the CO2 through a series of units operating at high temperatures, usually between 300 and 900 degrees Celsius. The image on the bottom left there comes from Carbon Engineering, which is a leading LDAC company that plans to launch a very big project in Texas early next year. This Stratos project will have an initial capacity, capture capacity of 500,000 metric tons per year, and that'll make it by far the biggest commercial DAC facility ever. Solid DAC, on the other hand, uses solid sorbents in a adsorption-desorption cycling process. The adsorption occurs at ambient temperatures and pressure, but the desorption occurs through a temperature vacuum swing process where the CO2 is released at low pressure and medium temperatures, temperatures around 80 to 100 degrees Celsius. So compared to LDAC, SDAC requires much lower temperatures, but also lower pressure, which adds complexity around building large-scale vacuum containers. As a result, the inability to build up these large-scale vacuum containers, a single adsorption-desorption unit would only be able to capture about 40 or 50 tons of CO2 per year. So scaling up would require stacking these capture containers, which are about the size of a shipping container. The image on the bottom right is from Climeworks. That's the leading SDAC company. Climeworks has commercial projects in operation today, more than any other DAC company, but most of these projects are really small scale. They developed the largest operational DAC facility today. That's Orca. It captures about 4,000 tons per year, and they're preparing to launch their next project, Mammoth, which aims to capture 36,000 tons per year. So these are much smaller than Carbon Engineering's plans, which are looking at 500,000 tons per year. And just of note, both Orca and Mammoth are located in Iceland, where they use geothermal to meet their energy and heating needs. Similar slide to what Jacques showed, just to give you an idea of the timeline of the scale up. As I said, Carbon Engineering and Climeworks are the leading DAC companies. They were also the first two DAC companies. Both were founded in 2009, followed by Global Thermostat the following year. As early movers, Carbon Engineering and Climeworks were able to maintain that lead in the DAC industry, while Global Thermostat ran into some management problems that they've since resolved, but nonetheless set them back. Other DAC companies didn't emerge until about 2015. Many of them bring slight modifications to the LDAC and SDAC approaches. So naturally, these newer companies are still in the demonstration phase. It's also worth noting that in the second generation of DAC development, where we're just kind of wrapping up, we're towards the end of that phase. We really started to hear more reputable agencies and think tanks, such as the IEA, refer to DAC as a key technology to reach net zero emissions by 2050. According to the IEA, to approach net zero by 2050, we would need to have about 85 million capture capacity of 85 million tons per annum MTPA of DAC capture capacity online by 2030, and that capacity would have to scale up to about 980 MTPA by 2050. Right now, if we add up all the DAC capacity for every project across the world, we have far less than 100,000 tons per year of DAC capture capacity. So we still have a lot of ground to cover and catch up to meet those IEA targets. The third generation in the industry will see a scale up of capacity led by companies like Carbon Engineering and Climeworks, which aim to bring individual project capacities up to that 0.5 or 1 MTPA level, or even higher if they're approaching it in phases over multiple years. But this is all going to require very smooth planning around financing, permitting, projects, the project partners, off-takers, et cetera. Beyond 2030, we'll likely see projects more regularly reaching that 1 MTPA or higher level. And we'll probably see a more robust market for CO2, most of which will go to sequestration, but some of it will be going towards utilization as well. For today, it's mostly food and beverage and greenhouses, but down the road, it'll probably be the CO2 will be used more as a feedstock for synthetic hydrocarbons, electrofuels. Most companies hope to reach the gigaton capacity level by 2050, but that would require 1,000 MTPA of DAC capture capacity. So it's pretty ambitious. There's just a quick map. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can see that most of the operational DAC plants today are located in Europe or North America. And even the projects that are online right now, they're not very big. As I mentioned, Climeworks has the biggest one at 4,000 tons per year. That's the Orca facility. And the next biggest one will probably go online later this year. And that would be the Mammoth one at 36,000 tons per year. And then as soon as next year, we'll see Carbon Engineering Stratus plant come online with 0.5 MTPA of global capacity. So, you'll see on this map that DAC is being developed across the world, but it's really Europe and North America. And we're really on the verge of taking those big steps up towards the megaton scale. Guidehouse Insights, Jack mentioned that we do we develop several trackers. One of them is a CCS tracker. We track projects not just for DAC, but for carbon capture projects across the board, across the world. So we were able to use that data, that tracker, to kind of easily extract some data that would help illustrate the tempo and trends of the DAC scale up. The first bar chart you see on the left kind of quantifies what the map showed you, which is that most of the activity for projects that are under development are in North America and Europe. Latin America hasn't seen much activity at all. The middle chart will show you the cumulative capacity of global if all projects maintain their planned schedule. That's a really big if. But if they do stay on schedule, then we'll have about 15 MTPA of DAC capture capacity online by 2030, which is still well below that 85 MTPA target that the IEA says is needed to reach net zero by 2050. So we'll have to really stay on top and scale this up faster in the next couple of decades. The final pie chart on the right shows the biggest DAC players. You can see it's a very concentrated market. Climeworks accounts for almost a quarter of all the megaton projects under development. Carbon Engineering and its partner 1.5 account for about 35%. Most of that's coming from that 0.5 MTPA Stratos project. And that's the only megaton project that is currently under in advanced commercial development. And then we have carbon capture, which accounts for about 40% of the planned megaton capacity project. And almost all of that's coming from one project. It used to be called the Project Bison, but it's since been renamed to the Wyoming Regional DAC Hub. And that project is quite large. They're hoping to scale up to 5 MTPA by 2030, but it's still not operational. Just a quick note on carbon intensity. For DAC projects to really realize their full decarbonization potential, several factors need to be considered. For one, in most locations, using grid power to operate the DAC facility will lead to higher overall emissions or really no net reduction. However, operating the facilities on renewable electricity alone might require some of the similar rules that they're being discussed and finalized with green hydrogen, rules around additionality and geographic and temporal correlation. But for DAC, these conversations are still not nearly as far along as they are for green hydrogen. Also, the destination for the captured CO2 is important. If the CO2 is being stored through sequestration, then it's being truly removed and retired, whereas using the CO2 for utilization will ultimately just re-release it back into the atmosphere. And finally, even if the DAC is being permanently removed and stored and retired, then the industry still needs to develop reliable and accurate standards and measurements to make sure that the projects are in fact storing what they were designed to store and that there's no leakage, et cetera. I know this slide's a little busy, so let me take a little bit of time to unpack it. Basically, when choosing the technology and location for a DAC project, it's really important to consider the requirements for LDAC versus SDAC. Both of them need a lot of energy and are therefore expensive to operate. Both prefer low altitudes, preferably near a sequestration site or an off-taker or a means of transportation infrastructure, and both take about 2 years to build. But there are also some really key differences between LDAC and SDAC. You can see on the right, we have a hypothetical scenario. What would be needed to build and operate a 1 MTPA plant for each technology? You'll see solid DAC needs more than twice the amount of land as LDAC. SDAC needs about 220 acres for a 1 MTPA project compared to about 100 acres for LDAC. And keep in mind, this doesn't include any kind of additional equipment to support the DAC facility, such as a newly built wind farm or solar park. So when it comes to operating the DAC plant, not surprisingly, liquid DAC needs a lot of water, probably close to 5 million or more tons of water per year, compared to about 100,000 tons of water per year for SDAC. Also of note, liquid DAC requires very high temperatures, as I mentioned earlier, upwards of 900 degrees Celsius for LDAC compared to about 100 degrees Celsius for SDAC. So what does all this mean as you approach gigaton scale? Well, building a 1 gigaton or 1,000 MTPA of DAC capacity would be approximately equivalent to recreating the global refining industry or recreating a third of the global gas industry. And it would add about 4 to 8% of current global renewable power demand. On the bottom left, I'm not going to spend a lot of time and repeat this whole quote, but it's a quote right from COO of Climeworks that pretty bluntly states that they simply don't have the capacity or the ability to produce some of the key components, such as the CO2 collector containers that are needed to really ramp up the gigaton capacity. Cutting down not just operating costs, but also capital costs is critical to successfully scaling up that capacity. I mentioned the Stratus project in Texas earlier. When Carbon Engineering and 1PointFive announced their FID, their final investment decision on this project, they estimated the cost at about $1 billion. So that gives us a sense of CapEx scale for a megaton project. But there are several ways to cut CapEx and OpEx for DAC projects. Economies of scale is going to be a big one. You'll see on the right some estimates that were provided by Climeworks that shows how CapEx costs can drop as projects kind of scale up from that R&D lab scale up to the gigaton scale. You can see a decline of as much as 63%. The economies of scale are going to be very important in terms of bringing down the CapEx costs. Another way to cut costs is through the electricity cost reduction. Jacques showed that one slide earlier that showed just how much these prices have already come down in the past 10 to 15 years. The levelized cost of electricity between 2012 and 2022 declined almost 65% for onshore wind, almost 54% for offshore wind, and almost 68% for solar PV. Other cost-cutting measures can include technology advancements, infrastructure build-out, and additional policy support, including an established price for CO2, either through a carbon tax or an open kind of an open market. Naturally, to achieve carbon neutral or carbon negative status, one needs a source of carbon-free power, but that can present challenges. For starters, to operate a 1 MTPA DAC plant, you'd need about 2 terawatt hours per year, which is equivalent to installing a 230 megawatt power plant that runs all day, every day. That's not going to happen with any technology, and you'll never get to that 100% capacity factor with wind or hydro, and definitely not with solar. You'd be lucky to get to a capacity factor of 50% for wind or hydro, and maybe 25% for solar. Land is another important factor to consider. Building a wind farm to support a 1 MTPA DAC plant, assuming a capacity factor of 53%, would require 64 square kilometers of land. Nuclear and gas-fired generation would give you some of the best capacity factors with the smallest land requirements. However, they'd also take the longest to build, probably somewhere between 3 and 4 years. And the gas plant would need to be equipped with point source carbon capture equipment, which would add to the CapEx costs. So how does one pay for these high installation and operating costs? There are several different pathways to make DAC projects more economically viable. I've selected a few here, some of the more popular ones. First, you could sell the DAC units themselves, which is what some technologies prefer to do. This works especially well for smaller, often modular units. They're often located right at the point of sequestration or the point of utilization. So for example, it's a small DAC unit that it gets fixated right to a hospital or a food and beverage manufacturer or a greenhouse. And this approach for a DAC developer allows them to kind of focus strictly on building their units and not worrying about all the other market factors. A second approach is the sale of the CO2 itself. CO2 is often viewed as a bad thing, but it does hold value in the market, increasingly so. CO2 will be seen as a critical feedstock for synfuels, as I mentioned before. And those synthetic fuels, those e-fuels are going to be very important to decarbonize transportation down the road. So CO2 will have a place in that market as well. And even today, in some remote areas, high purity CO2 can sell for up to $700 a ton. On the bottom left, we have the pre-sale of carbon dioxide removal credits. To qualify for credits, the project has to focus on the permanent retirement of CO2 through sequestration or mineralization. But again, there could be real value here with DAC spot prices in the CDR market now are about a little above $700 a ton, which can make DAC really competitive when you consider the capture costs that we reviewed earlier. And keep in mind, there are not many operational DAC facilities today, so almost all these credits are being sold before the facility is even operational. Lastly, and I'm cognizant of time, but lastly, one of the last business models I wanted to go through is just government support mechanisms. And this could take a lot of different forms. In the US, they've offered direct grant funding through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, allocated $3.5 billion for DAC hubs, and $1.2 billion of that has already been awarded. The U.S. also offers the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture projects. The Inflation Reduction Act made these tax credits especially generous for DAC. They offer $180 a ton if the captured CO2 from DAC is permanently retired, and even $135 a ton if the CO2 is utilized. In other parts of the world, governments impose carbon taxes on emitters, and that encourages DAC as a way to offset the liability. So markets are another way to close the financial gap on DAC projects. Most of the markets are really just market mechanisms that were set up by governments. California's low carbon fuel standard is among the most popular. It offers credits for operational DAC facilities located anywhere in the world, not just in California. Many other states and Canadian provinces are beginning to emulate the LCFS model. In Europe, the emissions trading system does not recognize DAC, but discussions are underway to incorporate that technology in the ETS. And just for a sense of scale, the LCFS credit prices are currently around $75 a ton, and the ETS is around 75 euros a ton. My last point on the DAC business models is it's worth noting that the voluntary carbon offset markets, the LCFS credits, and the 45Q tax credits can all be stacked. So one project can pull all three of those levers if the project qualifies. Another more traditional way of funding nascent DAC technologies companies is through just commercial funding. Not surprisingly, the companies that have raised the most money were the earliest movers for DAC technologies, or some of the fastest movers towards megaton projects. Climeworks stands out head and shoulders above the other companies with almost $800 million raised so far. As I just mentioned, there's also the pre-sale of offset credits. So Carbon Engineering might be behind Climeworks in terms of commercial funding, but Carbon Engineering is the clear leader when it comes to pre-selling offset credits. They've sold more than 740,000 credits so far to date. And for context, the spot price, as I mentioned, for DAC CDR credits right now is trading at $710 per ton. So hypothetically, if 740,000 plus credits sold at $710 a ton, that would equal more than $500 million. I mean, but it's worth noting that these markets are extremely volatile. They've been taking off over the past 2 years. The CDR voluntary off carbon market had reached $2.8 billion in May, which was up 180% on the year and up almost 700% since May of 2022. So there's no guarantee that the price is going to stay that high, but it's worth noting that there is tremendous value there. You'll also note that behind carbon engineering, you'll see Climeworks and carbon capture. Again, earliest movers or the companies moving the quickest towards to megaton scale. Also worth noting that out of the almost 1 million tons of pre-sold DAC credits that are being displayed on the slide right here, only 100 tons have actually been delivered. So lots of money being made for projects that aren't even operational yet. All right, so to wrap up the DAC part of the presentation, I have 2 more slides. Here we have listed some of the factors needed for DAC to successfully scale up. On a regional and national level, DAC projects will continue to need government support, which includes both funding and the clear guidance on how to access the funding. Any such guidance can and should include standards around MRV, measuring, reporting, and verifying to make sure that the CO2 being sequestered actually remains underground. Then there are geographical factors such as being located near depleted oil and gas fields or a saline formation that will store the captured CO2, or at least being located near a readily available off-taker, such as an indoor farming or beverage maker or synfuel producer. You'll also need low carbon power, as we discussed, to operate the facility. This could mean being located in an area that has strong renewable potential, or other forms of low carbon grid power. But it's worth noting that there are some grids out there like Norway and Iceland that are already almost zero, have very low carbon intensities, which makes areas like that especially attractive for DAC. As for the market players themselves, planning will be critically important for a company's success. Most likely the DAC companies that lead the pack tomorrow will be the ones that already have a sturdy vision today. This vision should include how to raise the capital and attract the funding, how they'll optimize their technology and reduce their capture costs, how they'll ensure a robust supply chain, including multiple partnerships for carbon management, sequestration, utilization. And finally, how do they intend to scale up capacity? It's most often through a modularized and phased-in approach. And so a few parting points. LDAC and SDAC have their own unique requirements and advantages. Both are still nascent, and most current technologies in the DAC space have a TRL, technology readiness level of 5 or lower. So most aren't even ready to go commercial. That said, there are a few companies that are looking to begin scaling up to megaton capacity, beginning as early as 2025, and then scaling up even higher in phases. And this should be able to take total global DAC capacity up to about 15 MTPA by 2030, again, if all announced projects actually deliver on schedule. Energy consumption, as I mentioned, is a really big consideration for DAC. It's one of the reasons it's such an expensive process. And to achieve all the desired environmental results, then the energy must be zero carbon, which presents other factors that need to be considered, such as capacity factors, land requirements, and the build time for the units and facilities. And finally, DAC is expensive to build and operate. So scaling up to megaton, then gigaton scale, will require big cost-cutting efforts from economies of scale, enhanced learning rates, private investment, government funding, and even government-backed markets to help kind of close the gap. So that's it for me, and I know we ran a bit over time, but I'm happy to stay later and field any questions, and I'll be available even offline after this if anybody wants to follow up with questions. But just wanted to say thank you for having us. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jacques. Thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation. I'd like to invite here Hitendra as well. Hitendra is the Executive Director of Gimi and the thought leader of innovation, and he will handle for what it remains the Q&A session.
You guys, thank you very much, Peter. Thanks, Jacques. Incredible presentation. So much content, summarized so briefly, and yet easy for us to absorb and access. So thank you for doing that. We are going to end at 10 o'clock officially for those who need to step out. But maybe Peter or Jacques, are you okay with staying another 5-10 minutes, if that's okay?
Yeah, fine on my end.
Okay, good. So for the audience, 10 o'clock, feel free to step out. We understand, but such an exciting topic. Stick around because I think there's some more nuggets we can kind of extract through some conversation. These were two very different topics of scaling up a new technology to be able to bring it to market, but some very similar ideas. Energy cost, CapEx, OpEx, trying to get it together, aligning the value chain to make sure people were all going to support it, governments. So it's a complex, messy thing, but there are similarities, right? And there's also a potential similarity that you could use a green hydrogen to maybe support the production or the sequestering of CO2 also, where low-cost energy could come in the future. So let me begin with the first question for both of you. In order for this value chains, both of you are talking about to be successful, what's a single number, single KPI that the green hydrogen folks need to kind of target for, and therefore it will happen? And similarly for DAC, what's a single KPI so everybody can keep an eye out on that number and watch that on their odometer or whatever it is that says we're getting closer and closer? What's the single number?
I'll answer for green hydrogen first. I think I kind of referenced it in the presentation where I talked about the €2 per kilo value. So that's roughly what you would need in Europe if you were just going to compete directly on cost with grey hydrogen, without any other kind of like subsidy support, without carbon pricing impact as well. So you could take that as your kind of what it needs to be ready just in a market without policy assistance. Then when you start to layer in, okay, now you have support through various auctions, now you have a rising carbon price and grey hydrogen facilities being included within that, that starts to creep up. But really that, if you can get close to 2, you're doing pretty well.
That's €2 per kilo.
Yes, correct. And then in the US, it's lower because natural gas prices are lower. So there you're looking at more like $1 USD.
And following that same number, what do you see from the government maybe providing a subsidy of some type that would make that number more likely to get to? And so what's the two numbers now? Government support as well as with this number that we're trying to get to. What do we keep an eye out on the government?
So if you take the I think the average value we were looking at in for LCOH in Europe today is in that kind of 7 to 10 euros per kg range, right? So you might draw an inference from that you need 5 to 8 euros of subsidy support for every kilo you produce. But it's interesting when you actually look at the results of the first bidding rounds, because they're competitive, bidders are going much lower with their bids. They'd rather some value rather than setting a high bid, which gets them all the way to 2 and not getting the subsidy support at all. So in a sense that's being assisted by, or at least that there's what they're betting on is that there are off-takers who are going to be willing to pay a little bit more in the short term, just so that they kind of have the kudos of being able to secure green hydrogen. But really, I think probably we're going to see in future rounds that those values are going to creep up even as the cost of production declines.
Very good. Peter, I'm going to ask you the same question for DAC, but Jacques, to prepare you, what will be the leading indicators that we should watch out for to show that we are making progress towards a green light? Okay, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of piggyback. It's a similar idea with Jacques. I mean, it's the carbon capture costs. I mean, that's an issue with all CCS. I mean, in theory, CCS being able to capture the carbon and do something with it that's responsible, whether it's utilization, preferably sequestration. I mean, it's a very attractive concept to a lot of, I mean, if you're a power generator, you can continue to do business as usual as long as you can capture that carbon. And so it's very attractive. And DAC is even more attractive because you can put these facilities theoretically anywhere in the world, you know, as long as you can keep your costs down by putting it close to where it's going to be, you know, offtake or sequestration. But the real problem with all CCS, but especially DAC, are those carbon capture costs are way too high. And now all these other levers that you're seeing emerge, whether it's the 45Q, market-based mechanisms like the LCFS, the carbon dioxide removal offset credit market, all these things are just being developed to try to kind of lower that cost and kind of bridge that financial gap. And so that's the really big obstacle, I think. And when you start to see those carbon capture costs go down, that's when you're going to see more and more uptake. In the meantime, the early movers are trying to make this happen through economies of scale and by pulling every lever that's available to them.
So Peter, you have the opportunity to create that number. What's that number? And that becomes the milestone globally because you said it.
The magic number for carbon capture? Yeah, I mean, like I said, it runs a huge gamut. I mean, you've got some processes that are currently in place that are highly concentrated CO2 streams, in chemicals and natural gas processing, where you can get this done for less than $20 per ton. And then you've got the other side, DAC, where some of them are still over $1,000 a ton. And so, I guess it depends on really, and like just in the middle kind of power generation is usually around $80 a ton. So, I guess the magic number would depend on the actual technology. I mean, I think a lot of DAC providers would be very happy if they can get it down to $100 a ton. But I think power generators and stuff, they're looking to try to get it down to $40 a ton or less than that. So I think a lot depends on exactly, where you're trying to capture it from, because even the way they approach DAC, there's no uniform way of doing this. I mean, some of them build very small units and they just want to crank them out. Some of them want to build these huge mega projects, so even trying to gauge the sense of the scale up from manufacturing perspective is difficult, because DAC is kind of all over the place. Everyone's taking different approaches, and so everybody kind of has their own metrics and their own targets.
Okay, so we'll move on, but let's just say it's some number between $20 and $100 right now is where you're targeting it to be.
I would believe so, yeah.
Okay, and Jacques, on green hydrogen, we're looking at about €2 per kilo is what the target is to be. Now, looking as evolution happens in technology, government announcements, partnerships formations, off-takers coming in at different places, what do you believe will be the early indicators? If you were at Wall Street, watching the stock market and making investments in this market, what are you watching for that gives you confidence that the industry is beginning to accelerate? It's beginning to move in the right direction, versus still trying to figure out, if you move, I'll move, and I won't move if you don't move, kind of situation where we might be in right now.
Yeah, I think that characterizes it well. And I think there has been a lot of investment in the sector, but that's based largely on these announcements and these targets and the presence of these, this hundreds of gigawatts of plant capacity. For me, what I would be focusing on in terms of like when we start to see an inflection point is just when you see sustained year-on-year growth and the amount of capacity that's actually shipped by manufacturers, even if it's relatively small values. So like I said, we're at somewhere between 1 and 2 gigawatts deployed today. Even if it's only a handful of gigawatts each year, if that value is increasing and then you can see a trajectory, that's definitely a positive indication. The other thing is that much of that pipeline that I've referred to, the several hundreds of gigawatts, it is actually concentrated in a few projects that are in themselves multiple gigawatt projects. So I think we need to see that trajectory towards ever increasing project sizes. Project developers have talked about the challenges of moving from a 10 megawatt project to a 100 megawatt project. It's not as simple as just stacking these technologies. Sometimes it sounds as if it is, but there are challenges that come in when you try to go to larger sizes. So I think we need to start to see a sustained shift towards larger project sizes, as well as just an increase in overall shipments.
Very good. So monitor the increase in capacity and monitor the size of the capacity increase also. So it's frequency and the capacity, which will give a good indication on that. Peter, on your side, in terms of DAX, how do you know?
It's a similar answer. I mean, we're probably 5-10 years behind the hydrogen electrolyzer market. So I mean, it's very important at this point that we actually see. I mean, you heard me say on the presentation several times, if these announced projects actually meet their, so it's a big if. I mean, right now we've got a couple of small operational projects. Okay, we've proven that the technology works, but can we scale it up? And when you've got a project that's on the horizon, like the Stratus project in Texas that aims to capture 500,000 tons of CO2 per year, it's very important that they actually deliver on schedule at that level, and they can verify that they're actually capturing that much. And that can happen. I don't think there's going to be some lightning bolt where it's going to be like buy, buy, buy. You know, I think those little things are just going to tell you that, okay, this is viable. This is actually moving forward. And there's several projects that are approaching that megaton scale over the next 5-year horizon that we can keep an eye on. Several in the U.S. with the U.S. DAC Hub program that we can watch. And if they actually start to deliver on schedule, I think that that's a very encouraging sign for DAC.
Excellent. Okay, now both industries are very strongly reliant on inputs, low-cost inputs, meaning energy, electricity, solar, green, whatever, low-cost inputs, water, or in some cases, even CO2 is an input for what you need. And then it's also very dependent on off-takers on the backside. Right? Off-takers will say, I'll pay for it as carbon credit on one side, or whether it's off-taker who's going to say, I'm going to use that energy to produce something. If you look at that, and you have to make a choice because you are the manufacturer of hydrolyzers, and you've got to make a decision to put your plants somewhere or build your capacity in different geographies. If you had to put a criteria, which geography, which region would you choose to invest in first? Because you have a limited number of talent, people, and capacity to build, but everybody sees this as a gold rush. So everybody says, come to my neighborhood first. How would you, the manufacturer, make a decision? Should I go to Brazil or South Africa or Morocco or to an industrial center like Louisiana? I have no idea why. You are in Louisiana, Peter, but that was one example. How do you choose? How will they choose so that the rest of the world knows whether they're first in line or they're last in line?
I think if I just look at what manufacturers have been doing so far, they definitely I think that their leading consideration is policy. So, you know, there wasn't that much activity in the US in terms of electrolyzer manufacturing. As soon as the RA came out, you had this influx of manufacturers, European manufacturers looking to construct facilities there. So I think that's the main thing, because even under, as I said, even under kind of ideal conditions, if you have high renewable energy potential area with an off-taker in that area, and that there's not a lot of examples of that. Usually you have either one or the other. Even those situations, you're still probably not cost competitive, so you're going to need that policy support to close the gap. So I would say, yeah, look at policy and also consider what the technology is. So I think smaller, more modular electrolyzer technology, so think PEM, anion exchange membrane. I didn't really explain the difference between these technologies in the presentation, but some are easier to produce in one location and then ship to another. Others, so kind of larger, bulky alkaline electrolyzers, you're really going to want to produce them as close to the deployment site as possible.
So Jacques, just to bring it to life, specific, make a guess, locations and your logic for those locations will be first versus some will probably be waiting in line.
I mean, it will be Europe and the US. Really depends in the US whether how attractive I talked about that there were these emissions accounting rules. There's still a debate around that. We'll see how that resolves. But if it resolves in a way that manufacturers and project developers think is beneficial, then I think you'll see a lot of momentum there. And then China as well, like their advantage is just that they can deliver units at much lower cost. So there is this concern that China will ultimately outcompete Western countries just on the cost side when it comes to electrolyzers. But those are the three kind of centers where we've seen the manufacturing scale up.
Got it. Peter?
Yeah, policy is very big for DAC. I mean, there's a reason the US is very attractive for DAC right now, and it's because you've got the government providing direct grants, you've got the government providing tax incentives, you've got some states that are coming out with the low carbon fuel standards and stuff like that. So there are a lot of financial levers to pull in the United States. So policy is very big in that regard. When it comes to deploying DAC, I mean, obviously, if you want a zero carbon source of power at an affordable rate, you'd want to chase the renewable rich areas of the world. You know, so obviously you're looking in, you know, Southern South America, you're looking in the Middle East and Africa and all those areas. But the other considerations with DAC is, you know, some of the, okay, land requirements probably not a big deal in Africa. You've probably got plenty of room to spread out, but do you have enough water? You know, and so there are other factors that you need to consider. So, I mean, I think a lot of these technologies, even deploying electrolyzers as well, I think they are drawn in theory to those renewable rich areas where they can tap into some cheap, low carbon or zero carbon electricity. But it's not always that simple. You know, you've got to, you know, move that hydrogen to the other side of the world where it's going to be consumed.
Got it. So you guys both said government plays a big role in here. I'm going to kind of step through that question, and now I'm going to go to off-taker. Is there or are there any off-takers who are big enough gorillas who could actually drive the industry and force this thing to happen, and they have a value proposition for their end consumers, and therefore they say we should do it and we'll pay the extra subsidy versus not through the government? And this is a big question: is who is that player who could perhaps lead the industry and not depend on the government?
I think on the hydrogen side, there's definitely, just as an overall trend, if you look at kind of who participates in conferences, who's involved in these discussions, you'll see more participation from developers, you'll see more participation from manufacturers, and the off-taker side tends to be underrepresented. Where I think I have seen a little bit more success with off-takers is kind of two scenarios. So one would be industrial gas suppliers who already have some kind of a gas supply business, either for fossil hydrogen, for other chemicals, who can kind of step in and act as an intermediary to aggregate demand. So they can go to someone that already buys grey hydrogen off them and say, listen, we can supplement some of this for green hydrogen. And they have this ability then to kind of balance between a larger portfolio of kind of end off-takers. The other scenario where I think there's been a bit more success is where the product that's being sold isn't actually the hydrogen, it's a decarbonized intermediary product. So you think about the H2 Green Steel project in Sweden. What they're selling isn't hydrogen, they're selling decarbonized steel. And then that's going mostly to the automotive industry, also to kind of heavy equipment manufacturers. So by the time that goes into the final end product that you're selling to the consumer, the additional cost that's imposed on it by using expensive green hydrogen is a tiny fraction of the additional cost to the consumer. So they have what they can think of as being a kind of low carbon vehicle, but you know, maybe it's only $100, $200 extra. So that's another scenario in which it can work even without government support.
That's very insightful. I think people should be thinking more about that as perhaps a way to pull the technology to the market. That's great. Peter?
From a DAC perspective, and really CO2 in general, I mean, when we talk about off-takers, I mean, you've got off-take for sequestration, which, so you might have some companies that they're, you know, that's what they do. They've got the well, they know how to drill, and they're applying for the permits, and they intend to be the final destination for that CO2. You've got other companies that are emerging that are just strictly carbon management companies. So they're happy to handle the logistics. They're not going to be capturing the CO2. They're not going to be pumping it into the ground, but they'll manage it, you know. And then you've got the utilization off takers, and that is a market that I think needs to grow up a bit. I don't think you're going to find a greenhouse or a food and beverage manufacturer or that's going to be able to take like multiple MTPAs, you know, a year. But what you will see are the companies that are focusing on synthetic fuel production. The CO2 is going to be a critical feedstock for synthetic hydrocarbons. So I think further down the road, as that technology develops and matures for utilization, that's who it will be taking a lot of the CO2 that gets captured.
Great. Good input. I'm going to ask one last question, then we'll try and wrap it up because everybody's time is important. You guys are already giving a lot of time for this conversation. On the technology side now, right? Right now on DAC, you mentioned there were two types of processes and how you're doing this on the electrolyzer side, the types of PMs and alkaline-based technologies and others. And there could be a third one and a fourth one that we don't even know yet, right? So right now, the trajectory you guys have forecasted is a slow trajectory for cost reduction. It's not a fast trajectory for cost reduction. Any surprises? Anything that you believe may surprise us coming out of a university research at MIT or Stanford or somewhere, or something coming out of China or in Russia where they're working on something that we don't even know about. And then you say, oh my God, here's some new stuff that's coming. Where is the emerging science and technology versus the core where everybody's focusing right now? Any surprises?
Again, just focusing on the electrolyzer side, I think the problem is that in order for you to reduce costs significantly, it's not just tackling one problem. So you'll read about a lot of breakthroughs around efficiencies. You might raise the efficiency from 70% to 90%, 95%. That will get you some small way in terms of cost reduction. But for you to reduce the cost of the molecule that you're providing, it needs to be efficiency, it needs to be electricity inputs, it needs to be the system costs. So I think it won't be a single surprise. It will be a combination of different innovations which come together to get you to this cost reduction scenario. But it won't just be just one thing, in my opinion.
Okay. Then let's go back to that just to make sure, Peter, before I come to you. Jacques, what is in the systems solution that is the biggest driver of cost or effort or whatever that's going to keep the price up, that people might want to focus in on? If you are in a university, you're a PhD student or you're a professor looking for funding, where to focus?
I would two things. One would be efficiency, again, if possible at the system level, but also at the stack level. The other one would be just the capital cost of the system. So a big contributor to the system cost is the use of precious metal catalysts. So that's a problem with PEM particularly. And the technologies which don't have those precious metal catalysts have kind of performance limitations. So alkaline, it's not very flexible. So if you're able to, and I think there is a clear trajectory for doing this, but if you're able to produce the iridium and platinum loading within PEM electrolyzers, and therefore reduce the capital cost, that would be a fairly strong lever.
Great. Well, all of you guys are studying your PhDs, research or whatever. That's the lever. Think about it. That could create the next set of 1,000 patents and potentially a game changing for the industry. Peter?
Yeah, no, DAC is, like I said, a lot younger than electrolyzers. So, I mean, there are still a lot of potential surprises. I think there will be efficiencies. There could be a change in policies in other parts of the world that make it more encouraging. But I think you're still going to see technology developments. I mean, you had just mentioned MIT. I mean, early in the presentation, I mentioned, LDAC and SDAC, but there are other technologies that are slowly coming out. And the electrochemical one just came out in 2020, right out of a lab from MIT. So, I mean, you're still seeing some things that might come up, and it's hard to. You don't know what you don't know, and so it's hard to project a surprise. But I think I'd also mention that one of the biggest obstacles for DAC is the energy requirements. So I mean, if developments are made with, like, for instance, modular nuclear, where you can get that zero carbon power, at a low price, that could be a game changer for DAC. So there could be a number of things that happen with DAC, but I think I'm looking mostly on the technology side.
Very good. Guys, you guys have been a wealth of knowledge. I think the audience was thrilled about all the questions and all the things you've answered. I've looked at the questions that were put in the chat, and I think we covered some of them, not all of them, but they'll reach out to you directly. Okay. What I'll do is I'll give you guys the last word, each one, 30 seconds or a minute to say something about your industry and what is the appeal to the audience, whatever it is, and take turns, and then we'll bring this to an end. But I just want to thank you guys. I've learned a lot about green hydrogen. I've learned a lot about DAC. I see the possibility of them being together as a future solution for it's carbon. It's carbon that we're trying to reduce ultimately, and green hydrogen does that. And sequestering actually helps with that too. So they're basically not in competition. They're completely synergistic in how they're working, but both are needed, and both have the same similar challenges. We're early, and how do you line up a whole community of people together to say, let's go together on this thing while driving the cost down? And it's going to require big efforts. So thank you. Peter, if you want to go first, and then we'll get a Jacques and we'll wrap it up that way.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, what's the lure for direct air capture? I mean, it's like basically the silver bullet. I mean, you can just suck that CO2 right out of the air, and do whatever you can to decarbonize every other aspect of the economy, but in the meantime, actually get negative with CO2 and start, setting our economy up in a different way. As you mentioned, if you take the green hydrogen coming from electrolyzers and you take the CO2 from DAC and you put them together, you've got synthetic hydrocarbons. Now you're decarbonizing one of the hardest to abate sectors, shipping, aviation. So, I mean, there's a huge draw for it, but and I've already gone through a whole presentation on the obstacles of scale up. It's mostly cost. That's really the big obstacle. But, in theory, DAC is extremely exciting.
Thank you, Peter. Jacques?
I guess the final thing I would say is that a lot of the time when you monitor the discussion around hydrogen, there's a lot of contentiousness around which end uses make sense. Should we have fuel cell electric vehicles? Should we be using hydrogen for aircraft, so forth? And I think that skews a little bit from the fact that even if we only use hydrogen, green hydrogen, that is for the applications in which we currently use hydrogen industrially, so methanol, ammonia, refining, you're still looking at a market that's 70 to 100 million tons per year. So we still need a massive scale up of this technology just to decarbonize what we already have. And very likely we're going to be using hydrogen for a few other applications as well, particularly steel, particularly long distance transport. So whatever happens with the transition, we are going to need more hydrogen and there will be growth in this sector.
Great. Thank you, Jacques. Thank you, Peter. Today we had great speakers from Guideline organization. These guys are leaders on the topic of green hydrogen, leaders on the topic of carbon sequestering. And if you have any questions, any help that you need, reach out to them, and I'll be happy to provide any support for that. They are a consulting organization, and you can see they've got deep knowledge, deep experts, and a breadth of knowledge across the whole globe. My appeal to everybody who's listening today is the following. Again, this is one of the situations where it's together we can. This is not a situation where one person can solve the problem. This is a systems problem. It requires system solutions. It requires the whole value chain to come together and kind of point in the same direction. It requires somebody to orchestrate it, of course, to say, let's go in that direction. But it requires you, whoever you are, to step up and say, we are part of that leadership to drive it forward, or we're going to put people together in a consortium to make that happen. But it's not going to happen by any one single player easily, because the obstacles are cost, the obstacles are big capital investments, the obstacles are technology, the obstacles are changing behaviors of using one energy source to another energy source and everything else. And therefore, each one of you think about what your role can be. I do believe each one of these value chains, whether the sequestering of carbon or the green hydrogen, is approximately $1 trillion economy. It's about $1 trillion of opportunity that's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And who doesn't want to be part of that growth story? And therefore, I look forward to each one of you coming up with some new ideas, collaborating through the Gimi network, and making it happen. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And remember,